The child care center on Concordia Station had been Valan's crowning achievement, and she had the blueprints to prove it. She had submitted the room configuration proposal 8 months before the summit, 47 pages, including appendices. The species-specific environmental zones had required 3 separate consultations with the station's climate control engineers. The Thessari children needed ambient temperatures 12 degrees above standard. The Kelvani needed darkness within a very specific lux range, and the Grolic required reinforced flooring because Grolic play involved what their parents diplomatically called enthusiastic physical contact, and what Valan's own research described as high-impact social bonding rituals. She had color-coded the dietary stations, cross-referenced biochemical compatibility for 47 individual children across 30 species, written the activity schedule in 15-minute increments. Standing in the doorway of the finished room 2 hours before the children arrived, Valan had felt her bioluminescence pulse with something she rarely permitted herself. Pride, clean, warm, steady. Her staff of 12 stood at their assigned positions, each briefed, each trained, each holding a laminated copy of the species-specific protocol summary she had condensed from the 600-page master document. She had published the definitive text on multispecies juvenile behavioral management. She had 3 advanced degrees from 2 of the most prestigious academic institutions in Thessari space. She had spent 60 years studying children. She was ready. The first child arrived at precisely the scheduled time. A small Thessari girl, escorted by her diplomatic aide parent who walked the child to the heated zone, said goodbye with practiced efficiency, and left. The Thessari girl looked at the room. She looked at her designated zone. She looked at the Kelvani low-light area across the room, which had a set of luminescent drawing tiles that were, objectively, more interesting than anything in her designated zone. She walked directly into the Kelvani area. The lights dimmed automatically as she crossed the threshold. She screamed. Valan's gill slits fluttered once. She gestured to the nearest staff member, who moved to redirect the Thessari child back to the appropriate zone. This was manageable. This was within parameters. The next 12 children arrived in a group: 4 Cathari, 3 Thessari, 2 Velni, a Kelvani, and 2 humans, one of whom was a 4-year-old boy who walked in, surveyed the entire room with his hands on his hips, and said cool, with the confidence of someone who owned the place. The Thessari children clustered immediately against the far wall, which was developmentally normal. Thessari juveniles in unfamiliar social environments default to intra-species grouping, but which meant they were occupying the observation alcove that Valan's staff needed for monitoring. The Cathari children began clicking at each other in the rapid staccato pattern that Valan's training identified as competitive play vocalization. Stage 1. The 2 Velni children wandered in opposite directions simultaneously, which was also normal. Velni infants have a developmental phase characterized by omnidirectional exploration, but which meant both of them needed to be tracked. More children arrived, then more. The room filled in 20 minutes, and the zones, her beautiful, carefully designed zones, dissolved within the first 5. The Thessari child who'd screamed in the dark had been redirected, cried for 4 minutes, and then been distracted by a Cathari child who was doing something with its chelicerae that made a sound like a rattle. Now they were both in the Grolic padded zone, which was not appropriate for either species. Valan watched the Cathari play fight escalate to something that sounded different, sharper, more rhythmic, the click pattern shifting from social to territorial, as a small Velni child blundered between them and disrupted the sequence. The escalation protocol required her to deploy a staff member with a scent-based social reset aerosol. She gestured. Her staff member moved. The Velni child, startled by the sudden motion, bolted. The 4-year-old human boy, Tommy, had been moving through the room with an expression of complete social fearlessness that Valan found simultaneously admirable and terrifying. He approached a Grolic child, easily 3 times his mass, and said, "Hi, do you want to play blocks?" The Growlic child, confronted with something it had never processed before, an animal 1/3 its size approaching without any apparent survival instinct, produced a warning bark, not aggressive, confused. The sound was percussive enough to knock Tommy backward 2 steps into the running Velny child. The Velny child went down, came up, saw the open door behind the distracted staff member who'd been reaching for the aerosol. Ran. Valan's bioluminescence, which had been pulsing with increasing irregularity for the last 12 minutes, began to strobe. The Growlic, named Greth, 6 years old, enormous even for his age, eyes wide and reflecting every light source in the room, had been processing the escalating noise since arrival. He found the gap between the storage unit and the wall. He wedged himself in. He began to make the sound. Valan knew this sound. She had written about this sound. At 3.7 standard years, a Growlic child's subsonic distress vocalization begins as genuine distress signaling and, if ignored, shifts into a tantrum reinforcement loop. Greth was 6, past that age. This was genuine. The frequency he was producing, somewhere between 18 and 22 hertz, traveled through the floor, through every child's feet, doing to their nervous systems what standing next to a malfunctioning engine does to an unshielded hull, vibrating the fine structures, disrupting the calm, making the world feel fundamentally wrong without any clear source. 3 Thessari staffers had developed migraines. 2 of them were now useless. Valan needed to deploy the pheromone calming agent, but that required her staff member with the aerosol, who was still trying to find the escaped Velny. The Kelvani child in the corner, Lissel, 5 years old, quiet as still water, had her outer plating micro-shifting in a pattern Valan recognized with cold clarity. Pre-eruption cascade. If Lissel reached full eruption, she would shed her outer plates in a defensive explosion. The fragments were not life-threatening to larger species, but could cause serious lacerations in smaller children at close range. The clearance protocol required removing all children within a 3-meter radius. Lissel was in a corner. 4 children were sitting within 2 meters of her, all of them too distressed themselves to be moved without triggering further chaos. The sonic dampener that would interrupt the cascade was in Valan's kit across the room. To reach it, she would have to cross the room. Crossing the room would expose her resonance organ to the open air of the space, and her resonance organ, which she had absolutely no voluntary control over, was currently producing an involuntary, high-frequency distress hum at precisely 340 hertz, the frequency at which Velny children cry. 2 of the Velny children had been crying for 6 minutes. She was making it worse. She knew she was making it worse. She could not stop. Her gill slits had found the drowning rhythm. Rapid, shallow, irregular, the frantic, useless motion of a system working at maximum capacity and achieving nothing. The door opened. The woman who looked in had the ease of someone who had walked into 100 rooms exactly like this one and personally made all of them better. Human, 40-something, dark skin, natural hair pulled back for practicality, dressed for a casual day on the station. She scanned the room in 3 seconds, not frantically, but systematically, the way experienced practitioners hit the high-priority points in sequence. The crying, the subsonic vibration, the strobing bioluminescence coming off the Thessari woman frozen in the center of the room, the still child in the corner, the gap behind the storage unit. She said, "Oh, honey, you need a hand?" Valan would later spend considerable time analyzing her own response to this moment. She was a senior academic at a prestigious institution. She had also never been offered help she needed so badly by someone who so clearly understood that help was required at such a precise moment of need. The stranger's voice had the quality Valan associated with competence in practitioners rather than theorists. Calm not because the situation was calm, but because the person had decided to be calm regardless, and that decision was clearly non-negotiable. Valan said, "The Growlic, behind the storage unit. His distress call is escalating the entire room." The woman said, "Okay," in the tone of someone receiving a weather report. She crossed the room. Every protocol document Valan had written, read, reviewed, and published said the same thing in multiple sections. Do not approach a distressed Grolic juvenile directly. The defensive response is involuntary and can involve physical strikes capable of breaking bones in smaller species. The correct procedure, the only correct procedure, was environmental stimulation reduction, species-matched pheromone deployment, and patient waiting. Estimated response time, even under ideal conditions, 45 minutes. The human crouched beside the storage unit, not in front of the gap, but to the side of it, bringing herself to Greth's eye level without presenting any forward-facing posture that a Grolic nervous system would read as approach. Valan could not determine if this was intentional. She suspected it was simply the body language of someone who had spent decades making frightened children feel safe and had internalized every posture that works. The woman said in a voice so low that Valan could barely hear it across the room, "Hey, big guy, it's pretty loud out here, huh? I don't like loud either." She reached into her bag. She produced a snack bar of some kind. She broke it in half. She held one piece out to the side, not extended toward the gap, just resting in her open hand where it could be seen. She took a deliberate bite of the other half. Her expression became theatrically appreciative. A performance, Valan realized, a deliberate and entirely instinctive performance designed for an audience of one terrified child behind a storage unit. She waited. Valan counted 40 seconds. At 41, the frequency of Greth's subsonic call decreased by a measurable amount. His eyes, enormous and luminous, appeared at the edge of the gap. They fixed on the snack bar. The human didn't push. She took another bite. She said, "I'm Sarah. This is pretty good. You want some?" An arm appeared, armored, thick enough around that Sarah's hand would not reach if she tried to encircle it. Capable of, according to every risk assessment Valayan had filed, breaking 3 of the major bones in a human forearm without effort. The arm extended slowly, and Greth's hand, disproportionately large, plated, the hands of a species that in adulthood moved stones, took the snack bar with extraordinary care. He sniffed it. He ate it. He looked at Sarah. Sarah smiled with her mouth closed. Not teeth. She had made the intuitive calculation that displaying teeth to a species that uses open-mouth expression as an aggression signal was inadvisable, a calculation that took Valan students 3 semesters to internalize. Sarah had arrived at it in real time by reading the child in front of her. She said, "Good, right? I've got more. Want to come sit with me?" Greth crawled out. He was twice her size. He sat beside her on the floor. She broke off another piece of snack and handed it to him without ceremony, the way you hand something to someone who is already part of your circle. The subsonic call stopped. The room changed. The vibration that had been working on every child's nervous system simply ceased, and in its absence, Valan could watch the cascade reverse. Children who had been escalating found their nervous systems no longer being pushed, and without that push, they began to self-regulate. 2 separate crises de-escalated without any intervention. She had 45 minutes of protocol. Sarah had 41 seconds and a snack bar. Sarah was already standing, her eyes on the Kelvani child in the corner, with an expression Valan associated with triage, not panic, but the focused assessment of someone who has identified the next problem and is already solving it. Valan caught her arm. The Kelvani child is in pre-eruption state. Her plating is micro-shifting. She kept her voice clinical because clinical kept the panic out. If she reaches full cascade, the plate shedding could injure nearby children. The protocol is to clear a 3-meter radius and deploy a sonic dampener at... "She looks scared," Sarah said. She walked to Lascelles' corner and knelt down. Valan started forward with no clear plan, except to interpose herself between whatever was about to happen and its consequences. She stopped 3 steps in. Sarah had held out her hand, palm up, open. The soft interior of a human hand extended toward a child who was preparing, neurologically and biochemically, to explode her own outer shell in defensive response to threat. Lascelles' micro-shifting stopped. The child's triangular optical cluster, 3 lensed eyes arranged in an equilateral configuration, each one a different shade of deep amber, focused on Sarah's hand. Valan processed the specifics in the same moment that she processed her own disbelief. Sarah's mammalian skin temperature was running high, the way humans always ran, and Kelvani were silicon-based and cold. The warmth radiating from that open palm was, in the sensory vocabulary of a 5-year-old Kelvani child, extraordinary. It was like standing next to a small sun, a sun that had knelt down to be at eye level and was waiting patiently. Lissel reached out and touched Sarah's palm. Cool, crystalline fingertips. Warm skin. The contact was so quiet that Valan almost missed the most significant thing happening. Lissel's plating realigned. Not perfectly. She was still stressed, and stress doesn't vanish from a child's body on contact. But the cascade broke. The pre-eruption sequence required a continuous escalation of internal pressure, and the contact, the warmth, the waiting presence of something that meant no harm had introduced a variable that interrupted it. Sarah said, "There you go. You're okay. Let's go find something fun to do." She led Lissel by the hand to where Greth was sitting, the largest child in the room, and the smallest child in the room looked at each other across whatever gulf of species and biology separated them, and found, apparently, that it was a shallow gulf. Sarah distributed snacks. Within 5 minutes, Greth was showing Lissel how his arm plates articulated, lifting and resettling them so she could see the layered structure, and Lissel was touching the plates with her crystalline fingertips in the focused way that Kelvani children touch things they find beautiful. Valan's gill slits had stilled. Her bioluminescence was doing something her staff later told her they had never seen before. A slow, deep pulse, like a heartbeat, but brighter. Not the pulse of calm, the pulse of something that has no category yet. The escaped Velni child was still missing. Valan's dispatched staff had covered the immediate corridor sections and found nothing. A 3-year-old Velni in distress would be moving fast and burrowing instinctively into any gap smaller than its body, which on a station meant it could be in an air vent, a maintenance crawlway, a cable conduit, or any of 17 other confined spaces that would require station security to access. She had filed the report. Security was responding. Estimated retrieval time, 25 minutes. Sarah organized a rescue squad. She gathered Tommy, Greth, Lissel, and 3 other children who had found equilibrium in the chaos, and she used the word mission in a tone that Valan would think about for weeks. Not mission as instruction, mission as invitation, as adventure, as something that elevated the participants. "Okay, team," Sarah said. "We have a friend who is lost and scared, and we need to find him. Who wants to be a rescue squad?" Valan watched the children's faces. Every species, every age, every biological configuration in that small group, and across every one of them, something lit up. Not metaphorically. The Thessari children's bioluminescence brightened. The Cathari children's Thessari lifted. Greth's posture changed from the rounded, self-protective curve of a child still processing stress to the squared, forward-leaning posture of a child with a purpose. Sarah assigned roles. Tommy was the scout. He received this information with the gravity of a general and immediately began running ahead in the corridor and reporting back in a breathless stream. "Nothing here. Nothing here either. There's a weird smell here." Greth was the listener. His Grolic hearing, Sarah had somehow intuited or deduced, could detect the specific frequency of a young Velni's distress call, at distances that rendered Valan's staff's instruments redundant. Lissel was the looker, her optical cluster capable of perceiving detail in small, dark spaces that other species would need equipment to access. Valan followed at a distance she told herself was supervisory. They found the Velni child 11 minutes later, in an air vent access point, 3 corridors from the child care center, 14 minutes ahead of security's estimate. Tommy talked to him through the grate. Greth made a sound, low, resonant, slower than his distress frequency, the sound Valan had only heard in field recordings of adult Grolak calming their young. He had watched his mother do this and stored it, waiting for a moment when it was needed. Lissel illuminated the vent interior with a soft glow from her optical cluster, so the Velni could see he was not alone. The Velni child crawled out and into Sarah's arms. Sarah held him and said something in the particular tone that exists in every language and no language, the one that means, "You are here, and you are safe." The Velni child made the soft, chittering sound Valan's research identified as post-distress self-regulation. He had probably been fine the moment he heard Greth's sound, but he needed the arms to confirm it. Valan leaned against the corridor wall. The slow, deep bioluminescence did its thing again. She thought, "I have published 47 papers. I have read everything written on multispecies juvenile development in the last 200 years. I have never thought to use the children themselves as instruments of rescue." The afternoon was unreasonable. Sarah had rearranged the child care center during the 11 minutes of the search, evidently directing her remaining staff, who had responded to Sarah's suggestions with more enthusiasm than they'd shown for their own protocols, to clear the species-specific zones and reorganize the space into activity clusters. Not species clusters, activity clusters. Greth and 2 human children were constructing a tower with the building blocks, a project that had naturally organized itself around Greth's capabilities. He was the foundation layer, the structural decision-maker, because his strength and precision with the large blocks was unlike anything the human children could achieve. They weren't helping him. They were building with him. The distinction mattered more than Valan could immediately articulate. Lissel and a Velni child were drawing. The Velni's drawings were explosions of color and motion. Lissel's were precise and geometric. They had started drawing on each other's papers. Lissel adding patterns to the Velni's swirls. The Velni filling her patterns with vivid color. A collaboration no developmental theory Valan knew would have predicted between these 2 species. The Thessari children, who had been fighting earlier, were now engaged in a game Sarah had apparently invented on the spot. A ball game with rules that changed whenever the current rules stopped being interesting. The genius of this was that the rule change mechanism transformed the Thessari's instinct for vocal debate into the game itself. The click language argument about whether the ball had crossed a line was not a disruption. It was the game. Their noise, which earlier had been territorial and escalating, was now enthusiastic and inclusive and somehow impossibly fun. Tommy was everywhere. He played with everyone. He sat with the Thessari children and tried to learn one of their click patterns. He showed Greth how to stack a smaller block on top of a larger one with more precision. He brought Liesel a drawing she'd left at the edge of the table and said, "You forgot this," with the sincerity of someone delivering important cargo. He was 4. He had not been taught that species were a reason to hesitate before saying hi. He simply did not know that they were, and the room was warmer for it. Sarah moved through the room the way Valan had hoped to move through the room, but different. Where Valan would have consulted her notes, Sarah looked. Where Valan would have applied a protocol, Sarah redirected with a word, a touch on a shoulder, a snack produced at exactly the moment a child's frustration reached its tipping point. She wasn't managing the room. She was living in it. The protocol binders Valan's staff had brought were sitting in a pile in the corner, untouched. Valan's 12 specialists sat in the observation alcove. None of them were needed. She asked Sarah about it during nap time, the only quiet the day had produced, and nap time had itself been a Sarah invention. Dimmed lights, soft ambient sound from a small device she produced from her bag, and Sarah lying down on the floor herself, arms open, eyes closed, with the unbothered certainty of someone who has done this thousands of times. What happened next was that a child lay down near her, then another, then, in a chain of trust that moved like dominoes, children from 6 different species arranged themselves in a loose constellation around the warm, still human, because if the safe person was sleeping, it must be safe to sleep. Valan approached when the breathing had deepened, and the room had found silence. She sat cross-legged near Sarah, whose eyes opened with the easy alertness of someone who never fully goes under when children are in the room. "How do you do it?" Valan asked. She had meant the question to be specific. It came out as everything. Sarah considered for a moment. She said, "Kids are kids. Doesn't matter what they look like or where they're from. They want to feel safe. They want to have fun, and they want someone to pay attention to them. Everything else is just figuring out what safe and fun look like for each one." Valan said, "But the behavioral protocols, the species-specific developmental matrices, those are about what kids are," Sarah said. "I'm interested in who they are." She glanced at Greth, who was asleep with one armored arm extended slightly, the way Grolacs sleep when they're relaxed enough to let their defensive posture go. Greth isn't a Growlak juvenile with subsonic distress vocalizations. He's a scared 6-year-old who wanted a snack and someone to sit with him. Her eyes moved to Lissel, who had curled into herself the way Kelvani sleep, her plating flush and still, her optical cluster dimmed to a warm amber glow. Lissel isn't a pre-eruption Kelvani. She's a lonely 5-year-old who wanted to hold someone's hand. She paused in the way people pause when they're not searching for words but waiting for the other person to catch up. "Your protocols are right about what these kids can do. They don't say anything about what they need. And what they need is the same thing every kid everywhere needs, to know that somebody cares." Valan's bioluminescence did something she could feel from the inside, a single, deep, sustained pulse. The kind that happened in Thessari physiological experience, when a foundational assumption was replaced by something true. She had 600 pages of protocols. She had needed one sentence. The summit ran 5 days. Sarah stayed for all of them. The Child Care Center became the most observed room on Concordia Station. Delegates found reasons to stop by, collecting children early, then standing in the doorway longer than collection required. A Grolak warlord whose diplomatic record spanned 4 decades arrived to collect Greth and found his son building a cooperative tower with a Velni child, a Kelvani child, and Tommy, who was providing structural commentary from beneath the table where he had decided the view was better. The warlord stood in the doorway with an unreadable face for nearly a minute. Then he sat against the wall and watched. He stayed for an hour without saying a word. A Thessari ambassador found her daughter asleep on the floor next to Greth, both of them curled around a stuffed toy Sarah had produced from her apparently bottomless bag. The ambassador's bioluminescence moved through 4 colors in 10 seconds. Valan recognized shock, recalibration, wonder, and then something she could only describe as the visual equivalent of a breath releasing. The children in that room were doing something the diplomats in the summit chamber had been attempting for a week with considerably more resources and considerably less success. They were learning that different didn't mean dangerous, not as a taught lesson, but as lived experience, accumulated the way children accumulate everything important, by playing together until the strangeness of the other becomes ordinary, and the ordinary becomes familiar, and the familiar becomes something approaching love. A human woman with a bag of snacks had convinced every child in the room that they were wonderful, and the children had believed her, and were acting accordingly. The last day was loud in the way last days always are. Too many goodbyes, too many children being collected by parents who had to be told 3 times that yes, their child was ready to go, because the children were not ready to go. Greth was collected by his father. The warlord stood with his hand on his son's massive shoulder and watched Sarah help Greth gather the drawings he'd made over the week, rolling them carefully so they wouldn't crease. The warlord said something to Sarah in Grolak. His translator rendered it. "What did you do to him?" Sarah said, "I let him be a kid." The warlord looked at her for a long moment with an expression Valan couldn't read. Then he nodded once and walked out with his son. Greth turned at the door. He came back. He wrapped his arms around Sarah, enormous armored arms, careful as hands can be when they have decided to be careful, and produced a sound from low in his chest. Valon recognized it immediately. She had only ever heard it in recordings. The field literature noted with clinical precision that it is produced exclusively for immediate family members and persists as a recognizable vocalization for the lifetime of the individual. Greth was making the family sound for Sarah. He'd known her 5 days. Sarah hugged him back with her whole self, no hesitation, no self-consciousness, and whispered something in his ear that made him produce the full-body rumble laugh of Grolic children, the one that traveled through the floor and made 2 staff members look up from across the room in surprise. He let go. He left. Sarah watched the door, and Valon could see the precise moment that the professional armor settled back into place, quietly, without drama, the way experienced practitioners integrate the exits of people they love, because this is the job, and the job continues. Lisselle's goodbye was quieter. She approached Sarah near the end and held out something small, pale, and geometric, a crystalline formation the size of a fingernail, 5-sided, translucent as sea glass. Valon recognized it with a jolt. In Kelvani culture, a fragment grown from one's own plating and offered freely was the most intimate gift in their material vocabulary. Children gave them to parents, to beloved teachers, and in the recorded literature, to no one else. Lissel had grown it deliberately. It takes Kelvani children 3 to 4 days. Sarah held it carefully, the way you hold something that matters. She looked at it, then at Lissel, and the professional armor came off without any attempt to put it back. She cried, not quietly. Sarah Okonkwo, 20 years in professional childcare, a woman who had said goodbye to hundreds of children. She cried with the uncomplicated fullness of someone who has never decided that tears are something to manage. Lisselle patted her knee carefully with one crystalline hand. Then she left with her parents. Valon met Sarah at the door. She had spent 60 years studying children. She had published 47 papers. She had never had one touch her voluntarily, and Greth had climbed on Sarah's back on day 3, and Sarah hadn't even looked surprised. She said, "My institute publishes the leading journal on multispecies juvenile development. I would like to ask if you would consider co-authoring a paper with me." Sarah laughed, the full one, the unrestrained one, the one that had been making children across species look up all week, because something about laughter is older than language, and every nervous system that evolved in a social context knows that sound means safety. "I wouldn't know how to write a paper," she said. "You wouldn't write it," Valon said. "I would. You would tell me what you know, and I would try to make the words as good as what you do." Sarah looked at her for a moment. Something passed across her face, recognition of something, or the decision to accept something. "What I do isn't complicated," she said. "I just love kids." Valon's bioluminescence did something new, not brighter, warmer, the spectral shift that Thessari produce in their most personal emotional registers, the register reserved for grief, held without shame, for love acknowledged without performance, for the recognition of something true that costs nothing to say and everything to forget. "Yes," Valon said, "that is exactly what I want to write about, because the galaxy has spent 10,000 years studying children and has somehow missed the most important finding in all of developmental xenopsychology, that love works, across every species, without exception, and a human with a bag of snacks knows this better than every researcher in my institute." She paused. "The paper will be controversial." Sarah grinned. "Good. Send me a draft. I'll check it between nap times." She touched Valon's arm, brief, warm, the easy physical language of someone who has never needed permission to be kind, and turned and walked toward the docking bay, and was gone. Valon stood in the empty childcare center. Greth's block towers were still standing. Lisselle's drawings were pinned to the wall, the geometric ones and the collaborative ones, the ones with the Velney's colors filling her patterns. The stuffed toy was in the corner where the nap constellation had gathered around it. The room smelled of snacks and children and the particular warm scent that accumulates in a space where things have gone better than anyone expected. Valan sat down at the observation desk. She opened a new document. She wrote a title, The Okonkwo Principle, on the universal efficacy of warmth, attention, and snacks in multi-species juvenile development. She stared at it for a moment, then she began to write. The paper was published 7 months later. It became the most cited paper in the field's history. The Institute rewrote its curriculum. The new practicum requirement, 1 semester in a human daycare, was met with faculty resistance on the grounds that it was not academically rigorous. The resistance lasted until the first cohort returned, changed in ways that were difficult to measure and impossible to ignore. Most of them lasted 3 days before calling their mothers. Valan hung Lascelles' drawing on her office wall. She had taken it from the childcare center when no one was watching. She was not professionally embarrassed about this. 47 children from 30 species had played together for 5 days, and not one of them had asked why the others looked different, because no one told them they should. Some things can't be studied into existence. They have to be lived. Sarah Okonkwo understood this the way some people understand weather, not as information, but as something you walk out into every morning and navigate with your whole self. The kids were always going to be fine. Someone just had to show up and love them first.